Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the second Women in STEM seminar, and it's on public engagement with climate science, which is organized by the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Education Committee at the Grantham Institute in Imperial. My name is Kathleen Hamilton, and I will be chairing this event. I'm the Partnerships and Programs Director at Force of Nature, and we're a youth nonprofit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. What that looks like is we mobilize youth through workshops, through creating pathways into historical seats of power. We run intergenerational dialogues and ensure that nonprofits and business leaders understand the role of youth and are engaging them in a meaningful way rather than being tokenistic. And we are all about working at that intersection of wellness, mental health, and climate action. We are going to be in this seminar engaging with 4 incredible youth activists. Hang on, I'm one of them. 3 other incredible youth activists. And we're going to be exploring attitudes and approaches to engaging with the public over climate science. We have some folks from some incredibly different backgrounds working in different spaces, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. But just before I do, some very quick housekeeping. We have, as I said, an engaging hour-long discussion, and you will have a chance to ask questions. Those questions, if you have them during the conversation, please feel free to drop them in the Zoom chat. I'm going to have some of my colleagues, Lily and Paloma, pulling those questions out and sending them through to me so that we can address them kind of towards the end of the hour. Please do keep yourselves on mute. If I ask you to unmute during the question section, please do then, but otherwise we are going to be holding the floor for the speakers. And as I mentioned, this is recorded, so if you would not like to be recorded, please feel free to keep your camera off, and if you prefer not to unmute, you can also just let me know in the chat. But without further ado, I'm going to come around to each of our incredible speakers and allow them to introduce themselves, and I am going to start with you, Harley.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thanks everyone for coming. Hi, my name's Harley. I am with Animal Rebellion. So Animal Rebellion is a nonviolent civil disobedience group, and we use tactics of disruption, taking direct action to highlight the impact of animal farming and fishing, so meat and dairy, on the climate crisis, and to kind of draw attention to that and shift the discourse around animals and the environment. So I focus specifically on communications and messaging in Animal Rebellion and in my external life as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Harley. And I'm going to come over now to Arunima.
Hi, I'm Arunima, and I am an innovative technologist and a climate activist from India. I have previously worked on a couple of environmental sustainability focused projects to solve global challenges, including climate-induced global challenges. And I am excited to be here today as a Circle of Youth member of Utopia, and I'm looking forward to this, to the amazing conversation that we'll be having.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rooney. And over to you, Chikodi.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Chikodi from Nigeria. I am an administrator and the community manager for SustyVibes, which is a youth-led organization making sustainability actionable for young people via implementing diverse sustainability projects. And I'm happy to be here to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chikodi. There was a little bit of background noise, so I'm just going to repeat some of the end of what you said. So Chikodi is part of SustyVibes in Nigeria, and they work on creating access to and making climate action actionable. I didn't know older than me, but in Nigeria and to communities in Nigeria, which is awesome. So with that, we are going to jump into the conversation. I have a few questions prepared, but of course, audience, listeners, feel free to pop some in the chat as we go, and I'll come to those sort of after about half an hour. But we are in a moment right now in history, right? The COP26 has just ended. It was a momentous occasion for a number of reasons, both good and bad. And obviously, it's one of the keystone moments of wide swaths of the public engaging with climate science, but just climate action in general. So I'd love to go around and get a sense of what people's reactions are to the COP and whether you were involved in any actions around it, what that kind of looked like, and really to get the sense of not whether or not it was successful, because I think it's very nuanced, but definitely what your feelings are around the communication around COP in particular, and kind of the engagement with the public, the engagement that maybe you had or you saw people around you having. So I'm going to start off with Harley, because I know you had a little bit of engagement and were out there speaking as well. So if you'd like to share your thoughts on the COP.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think COP is, again, like you said, it's such an interesting event because it really is one of those moments where people are engaging and also engaging in like leadership, engaging in what action leaders are taking. I think like the resounding sentiment that I've seen coming out of COP is disappointment and that it wasn't good enough. And I think, you know, that's really true. And I think a lot of people are speaking out against that and saying that the promises made or the agreements made aren't even kind of approaching what is needed to affect the change that we need to see for the climate. But I think like what strikes me even more than that, because maybe it's pessimistic of me, but I went in there expecting to be disappointed. But I think, so what really stood out to me was that more so than the decisions being made having, you know, not much of an impact, is that there's so little avenues for people to kind of have an impact on the decisions that are made. So, for example, I didn't spend much time at COP, but from what I saw, there was a big separation from the people who were there to kind of protest and to say, you know, even before the decisions that were made, that these aren't good enough, they're not going far enough, this isn't actually leading to the change that we need to see. And the actual people making decisions. And I think this really stands out to me as being a big cause for concern, that like avenues for expressions of concern, avenues for people to have an input into these processes are so few and are so limited and are so kind of, they're only really given to those who are in these privileged positions of power. So one thing that really stands out to me is that, you know, at COP, there was, I think it was something like 16,000 police who were there in a large part to prevent peaceful protest or to stop it being able to actually impact the goings on. And I think what I think is that, you know, if decisions are being made that are actually in the interest of the people, they don't need that much force to try and stop people protesting. So I think COP is really interesting. It's obviously really relevant. And the biggest questions that come up for me is that why are people who are having these legitimate concerns not able to take part in these kind of processes, and how can we make it so that these really important decision-making spaces aren't being presented in such a way that there's people in the room and we all are outside knowing they're going to make decisions that we're not going to be happy with, yet we can't do anything about it. So yeah, I think it's just really fascinating, really worth talking about, and something that needs to change.
That's awesome. Thank you, Harley. And I definitely, picking up on this kind of like division that you're speaking about, and people who have opinions and have thoughts and know what's best for their communities. Definitely have some thoughts on that, which I will share. But first I want to come over to Rooney. I'd love to hear your thoughts as someone who I know is like working in climate science and thinking about all this, and now to be seeing this. I'd love to know what your kind of like public opinions are and thoughts on COP and kind of the communication around it as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm just going to echo a bit of what Harley said. I don't think, so I wasn't at COP26, but I have been, following it religiously, you could say. I don't think the COP26 was really inclusive. I felt that some communities were underrepresented, because we always talk about, giving a voice to communities, to people that are not really, adequately represented. I don't think it's not that they don't have a voice. I just think that they're not given the platform, they're not given the visibility, the opportunities or resources to use their voice, which can, their voices can be powerful and knowledgeable. But something that I was disappointed, you could say, by the most was that the future of fossil fuels and subsidies is not completely obliterated. I think I think the phrasing was changed from phase out to phase down by US, China, and India. And coming from India, I think India is relying on coal power to just further all the developmental targets and ambitions. And it's a bit worrying. I think I'd say that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really pertinent reflection. I know Chikodi has just jumped off to relocate so that there's a little bit less background noise. So I'll come around to Chikodi when she's back. I was at COP26 with the Force of Nature team, and we did actually have access to the Blue Zone. So we were in, and for anyone that isn't aware, the Blue Zone is kind of the official delegation area. It's where all the negotiations happen. There's all of these kind of like country pavilions where countries get to kind of peacock around what their ambitions are, and they hold events and things like that to engage with people who are in the Blue Zone. I think something really interesting about both what you've said, Rooney, and what you said as well, Harley, is this idea of, okay, first of all, are people even in there having their voices heard? And interestingly, this was labeled like the most inclusive COP yet, which is super problematic because it wasn't necessarily that inclusive. What I will say is there were so many speakers on like the main stages within the Blue Zone who were Indigenous leaders, who were like, you know, communities from like underrepresented or previously colonized countries who are like, you know, now the front lines of climate change, right? But what I noticed was while they may have the stage, it didn't always feel like those people were being properly listened to, right? So I think there's also a really key difference between platforming people and actually listening to them and like taking actions off the back of very clear pleas and recommendations. If no one has heard, there was an incredible speech by Vanessa Nakate. I believe it's available on YouTube under the UNFCCC YouTube channel, which doesn't have many subscribers, unsurprisingly. But Vanessa Nakate made this plea to world leaders to like listen, to do something. And listening to this pleading from this youth activist who is like very literally facing like the effects of climate change in her community, and then seeing world leaders vote against reparations and loss and damage payments was shocking. And I think that even just going into the Blue Zone, there's such a clear exclusion, and it's very much this kind of bureaucracy, right? It's even if you come into the Blue Zone as a young person or an Indigenous leader or a youth from an underrepresented community, in order to engage with any of the politics, you have to understand all the speak, you have to understand how everything's written, you have to understand all the different negotiations and who you have to speak to in order to influence decisions. And there's so many barriers to being able to engage in a meaningful way. And they make it so difficult that it's not surprising that people are having trouble engaging with it. And it's like it's been designed that way, right? So I think there's also a question of, in any of these old world institutions, like these kind of like governmental bodies, like I know within, you know, science and the science community, within academics, within these kind of institutions, who is being, first of all, platformed, who is being listened to, and how are we actually creating access to spaces that means people can engage in a meaningful way, versus how are we intentionally excluding people through these structures of power, right? Which is a really interesting question. And I'm going to use that to segue into a discussion question. It doesn't look like Chikodi has joined us back again, but if Lily or Paloma, you can just give me a heads up when it looks like Chikodi is back. I think she's probably looking for some internet connection. Please let me know so I can make sure we come back to her as well. So I'd love to know, Rooney and Harley, your thoughts on kind of like engaging with the public generally, and you can definitely use examples from COP if you'd like to, but also just more widely, even within your organization. Like, what do you see as working or not working in engaging with the public around climate and climate science and kind of these conversations that we're having? So what works and what doesn't work in your view when we engage with the public around climate? Rooney, I'd love to come over to you first. And feel free to like field the question to someone else if you want more time to think about it as well.
No, it's absolutely perfect because it just ties to the to everything that you said about communities being excluded from important discussions and negotiations. So I wanted to touch base on this and this theory that I learned in school called Eco-Feminism. So I think, it's a really advanced theory, but if I just had to just water it down and explain it in a sentence, it would be that historically, both nature and women have been, they've been oppressed by these patriarchal systems of power that you were just talking about. And these systems, they make both environmental justice and gender justice, difficult to achieve. And so it's just a proponent for environmental justice and, by virtue, climate justice from an interesting lens of feminism as well, because activism nowadays, it's not, one dimensional. I think it's intersectional. It combines so many, you could say, different fields and different, you could say, areas of activism together. So the ongoing climate crisis, it disproportionately, I don't know why I laughed at that. I was just trying to make it a bit dramatic, I guess. So the ongoing climate crisis disproportionately affects marginalized people and women, especially people of color and women of color in particular. And I remember you talking about these barriers that exist in place. I think some of these barriers are, racism, definitely, sexism, and also post-colonialism, because most of these countries are still recovering from, the devastating impacts and consequences that they had to go through once they were, for the lack of a better word, liberated from the dominant power forces. And another barrier you could say could also be poverty, because all of these, they intersect with climate and environmental issue. And this in turn, intensifies the vulnerability that we've been talking, especially when it comes to the consequences of climate change, because I think it's a well-known fact by now that people who have zero responsibility, or people who haven't contributed a lot to the ongoing crisis, are the ones who have to, face the devastating impacts of climate change. And that's completely unfair. And this is something that I remember, remember from one of my classes. So I think a climate activist and author, Kathleen Wilkinson, she said that women's participation and leadership can help to achieve, better policies when it comes to negotiations surrounding climate policies. So it's really important to, how to put it this way, so it's really important to tackle all of these different systems that subjugate both climate, the nature, and also the voices of women. And it's really important that we work towards representing voices that are underrepresented. But as we just talked about it, I think it's where it's tokenist right now in nature. So it's important to include that kind of intersectionality when it comes to climate justice. And I think all of the conversation that we've been having so far really sort of connected with each other.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I so love what you said about kind of like empowering women and girls. And, there's this stat that I heard from a woman who works with young women in, I believe it's in South America. And she shared at COP that there's an estimate that education and empowerment for women has the potential of avoiding 85 gigatons of carbon emissions by 2050. But much larger than that, it's actually around creating pathways for young women and girls in communities to be able to get that education so that they can be part of legislative actions, protecting land areas, taking care of their family in a way that allows for more environmental action to happen. But I think also what you said about having representation from frontline communities, and what we've kind of talked about, not just having people represented, but actually listened to and held up into a leadership position. One of the interesting things that I noticed at the COP, but also just more widely around this dialogue around climate and climate science and climate change, is in the parts of the world where people are living in a bubble of climate privilege, very much like myself in the UK and in Portugal, but in general, a lot of the West, there's this conversation around climate that talks about it happening in the future, right? That talks about future generations being affected by climate change, when the reality is there are people living today and people dying today as a result of climate change. And that's part of the conversation that so often gets missed in these dialogues and is so important to emphasize. And also that for people in those communities, there's not necessarily a thought around climate change as this big global nebulous thing. It's much more immediate, right? It's what's happening at home. It's like, are my crops growing? Is my family able to get water? Am I able to solve like daily immediate challenges? So with that, I really wanted to come over to Chikodi just as like a summary of kind of what we've said. I know you had to move to get some more stable Wi-Fi connection and quiet background, but we're kind of chatting about our impression of the COP, but more widely than that, like how we see the conversation around climate science being accessible or inaccessible. So what that communication looks like. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you around what your impression is, like working with SustyVibes, but also just like being where you are in the world. Like what does that conversation or engagement with the public look like around climate and climate change and climate science? And what do you think works well and what doesn't work so well?
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Yes, so my take on the COP26 would be that, yes, the conversation has been held. People got to engage at the conference, and I actually had colleagues of mine who went there, although I was not physically present there, but I kind of follow conversations on, what happened at COP26. And one of the major things my SustyVibes community actually picked out was that there were lots of conversation held, but there were no concrete plans as to how to execute and implement all of this. And I think that's like a huge challenge still for us, because if we're always going to meet without concrete ways of implementing and executing, there is still a major problem to be addressed. And so I want to say that, what youth-led organizations like representatives of SustyVibes here and every other organizations present here can keep doing is to keep driving those projects, keep implementing it, keep having the conversations. Let's not stop at it. Let's continue. I mean, we'll get there eventually. That's why I have to say we'll get there, even if it doesn't seem like the big parts, so to speak, are implementing. We will, at our own local level and our own capacity, do the best that we can. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, absolutely. And I love what you said around like community action, right? And it's like, even if things feel hopeless or there's a moment of feeling a lack of faith in political leadership, like keep doing the work, keep working within communities, keep taking actions towards a future that we're trying to design, because there's a lot of promises from political leaders, but not necessarily a lot of concrete plans. And as we've even seen coming out of COP, a bunch of governments signing legislations for new fossil fuel drilling, which is like not really meant to be part of the plan. But I'd love to come over to you, Harley, as someone who engaged, and you spoke a little bit about like the hopelessness and kind of going in with low expectations. I'd love to hear a bit about like in the way that you at Animal Rebellion like engage with the public, like how do you drive action through the narratives? What does an effective kind of strategy around that look like for you?
Sure. And I will say that I'm actually a very hopeful person. Despite my pessimism, I like to think of myself as a hopeful pessimist. Because I really do believe in change, and that's, I think, part of the reason like I'm involved with a group like Animal Rebellion, which is all focused on the ability for people to make change, and the kind of like the way that people have made change throughout history. And I think like the question of like how to engage with people and like what works and what doesn't, I think it's a really interesting one, because obviously in Animal Rebellion we're focused on not just an issue that's, I think, very pressing with such as the climate crisis. We're also focused on an issue that's a lot more niche, which is, the specific role that like animal agriculture plays within that. So I think like that question of how do we connect with people and how do we engage with people is always at kind of the forefront of what we're doing. And I think as to the question of what works, I think something that's been touched on a lot already by Rooney and by yourself is this fact that people's Like people aren't just these, blank slates who are waiting to fill up with our message and our communication. Like people have these very full and rich and nuanced and complicated lives. And when we're trying to kind of like communicate with them and get them to care about something, and especially get them to take action on something, that's asking a lot of someone. Like we can, like when we're like in it and we're, we care so much and we're so passionate, we can kind of like get stuck in this thought that, I don't understand why people don't care, and I don't understand why people just won't do this. But what I think we forget sometimes is that it really is asking like a massive amount of someone, like even just to, get off the couch and step outside and do something they've never done before. It's a big, like from a behavioral point, like perspective, it's a big thing to do. And I think one area that I find a lot of hope in is that we've won a lot of fights when it comes to communication. Like, research has proven time and time again recently, like communications studies proven that we've won the fight on people believing that climate change is real, that it's happening now, and that it's urgent. And one of the biggest things we have to fight against is the sense of hopelessness and like doomism, that it's happening and there's nothing we can do. So I think like when we think about what works, we can think about this idea of like empowering people to show the change that they can be part of, and empowering people to see where they fit into making change. So looking at something like direct action, which is obviously what Anna Morabayan focuses on, what like this particular method of communication and engagement does is I think it pushes something into the mainstream. So it takes away one of those barriers of entry, because, it's one thing to ask someone to seek out information by themselves. But if something is being like dramatized so much that it's in the news, it's front page of all the websites they're looking at, it kind of takes away a bit of a barrier of entry, because then suddenly they're presented with a topic that they can then look a bit more into, they can get more information on. And I think that's a really interesting thing of just like taking away these barriers of communication. And I think that can be done in multiple ways. It can be done by dramatizing something, such as through direct action. It can be done with what Chikodi was talking about, and this importance of like community engagement and focusing on what people can do in their own communities and the change that they can make. It can be done through these more like theoretical frameworks that Rooney was talking about, and these other ways of engaging people on this like, I guess, deeper level. And I think that can be really powerful, just giving people multiple points of entry into these issues and allowing them to take action. And I think as to, what doesn't work, I think, we've seen time and time again that the government, and especially groups that have an interest in things remaining how they are, they use a variety of methods. And I think sometimes just by default, we, in the kind of change-making sectors, we seem to pick up these methods as well. And one of those is by pushing like personal choice and like personal action taking is like the default, the only thing that people can do. And it's interesting because this actually does come from this kind of like delay tactic of, rather than these big corporations making changes that need to happen, it gets put on the individual. It gets said that, well, you need to drive less, and you need to, take 2-minute showers and recycle and, do all these kind of individual changes. And I'm not saying those aren't important. What I am saying is it takes the blame away, or the kind of the impetus for change away from these corporations. So I think what I see as being a really powerful kind of shift that I've seen in Animal Rebellion is encouraging people to be part of this like pressure on these big corporations to make change, rather than kind of having this hyper focus on, well, you need to do this and you're wrong if you don't do this. So taking away the blame and that kind of like eco guilt, on that eco anxiety, and instead saying like, there is a problem, there is a challenge, and what we need to do is we need to face it together, and we can come together and we can face it. So I think I'm really big about empowering and like moving towards this idea of like collective action, where we can all kind of lead to the change that we need to see from these like forces of power.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's so interesting, I think, what you spoke to around putting the onus on individuals and that being kind of a delay tactic. There's something interesting in that as well, where the other side of that, right, is that we're in this like hugely complex issue, and those of you who are listening who are in the sciences, like you see how all of these things link together, right? And it's just this kind of like snowball effect, but there's also all of this data and all of this information, and it's like if you change one thing, you also want to change the other 8 things. And I think we feel the same thing within climate action, and definitely one of the things that became more and more visible and more talked about at the climate summit was very much about this kind of like intersectionality of the issues, the way that it affects many people in different ways. And with an issue that complex, the question then is, well, how do we make that actionable for people, right? How do we actually communicate in a way that allows people to feel agency to take action? What was really interesting was the lack of scientists at the COP. I did have the pleasure to engage with a number of Natural History Museum scientists, and the Natural History Museum brought a whole body of scientists up, and we're part of doing some programming in collaboration with the New York Times Climate Hub that was out there. And the most interesting thing that I saw was that, in fact, the ways that the scientists ended up engaging with the public was not through standing up there and reciting facts and figures and talking about the numbers, but was through telling stories, where we had evenings where each of the scientists in their respective fields, we had biodiversity experts, we had experts on, you know, like crops and like the health and well-being of farms within climate change and what that looks like. And these scientists didn't get up and tell us the facts and figures, they told us stories, and they invited people from affected communities to come and tell stories. And I think there's something really powerful there in terms of the way we engage with people, rather than feeding people information, meeting them where they are and telling them a story or illustrating a story in such a way that people can empathize or understand. And then I think the other question that really comes to mind for me that I'd love to pose to both Rooney and also to Chikodi is, like, with this kind of big complex issue, right? Like Rooney, you spoke about ecofeminism and also like the intersectionality of climate issues. Like, how do you see effective communication happening that allows people to feel like they can engage? What does that look like to you in your sphere? Because I know as well you're very like focused in the academic and the science community right now. So what does it look like? How can effective change happen, but how do we do it in a way that communicates the urgency of the issue without overwhelming people with how complicated it is?
That's a great question. And I don't think there's, you know, a straightforward answer to it, because everyone communicates with and engages with climate science and climate action differently. So, you know, engagement and participation looks different to different people. So there's no one size fits all solution. While, you know, some of us will be at the front lines, actively protesting, demanding, you know, accountability and action and pushing for better reform, some of us will just be learning about it and educating others, just spreading the message and letting, you know, others know that we are in a crisis and that we need to work on it. So I think even an effort as small as, I mean, there's no effort that's small, because at the end of the day, it's just an accumulation of individual efforts. But even influencing your community, influencing your friends, influencing your family is also engaging with climate action. And something that I learned about while working with the National Geographic and the Nature Conservancy was that you need to be able to communicate all of these issues in a manner that kind of, you know, strips away the global, it doesn't fully strip away the global context of it, but you just need to re-communicate it in a local context. So like you said, spitting scientific facts is not going to help, because I don't think it's going to get people to care. So you have to communicate these issues in a manner that's actually going to get them to care. So something that I can think of is that, you know, instead of saying that the temperatures are going to be rising and the ocean levels are going to be rising, if you can just repurpose it in a local context, like say, if you live on a coastal area, the sea levels are going to, you know, increase, and in a couple of years, it's going to submerge the land, and that's going to get, you know, people to care. So I think it's really about, you know, effective communication, effective science communication, because that's something that we are unfortunately still, you know, lagging behind in. But I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it definitely did. And I totally hear you on the like making it local, making it approachable, like kind of scaling back the issue by making it more immediately relevant for people, right? I think this is really important, this idea of meeting people where they are. And I'd love to hear from you, Chikodi, like what do you see as like ways we engage with people? How do you at SustyVibes engage with people that allows them to feel like they can take action in the face of something that could be really complex and overwhelming?
Thank you. I was just listening to her speak, and I could relate to what she was saying because so she made mention of not making the whole situation look really disastrous, and I think that is important because it further contributes to eco anxiety when we make or when we tell the stories in that manner. And so I think it's important that we're careful about this. And she gave like some examples as to how to get to, I think there's what we call passive communication. I want to believe that's what it's called. And so, okay, for instance, we have Subsidies. We get to use things that people can relate with. So, for instance, we get to explain we went to a community and then people were excreting in the same waters that they were drinking from or washing with. And it was really, I mean, that's like what gives rise to, sicknesses and diseases. And, the major one in Nigeria, malaria and the rest of it. So, we got to let them know that when you get to use the same water you use for cooling and everything, so you let them know that okay, this is like a major cause of sicknesses and diseases, and but you now prefer the solutions to them at the same time, letting them know these are the things that you can do. For instance, you avoid using the same water you use in bathing and washing for cooking at the same time. So while you're letting them know about the challenges, you also let them know about the solutions. That's on one hand. Then secondly, we also use things like local languages. So take for instance placards. We get to design placards in local languages. So for instance, in Nigeria, we have various communities and they speak different languages. So you narrow it down to languages that they can easily understand and they're able to relate with. Sometimes it's difficult for our community members, but we'll go the extra mile to do all of this so people can relate with it. That's the second thing we do. And thirdly, you let them know that they are also a part of it. So for instance, we tell people that every actions you take in the environment, I mean, everything that happens in the environment, we are primarily responsible for it. Like humans are the major contributors to climate change, so to speak. And when you let them know, it sort of sets the channel of discussion to let them know that, hey, you're responsible for this. And at the same time, you're also responsible for curbing this. So it's a two-way thing. That they don't feel like there is a doom ahead of them. And at the same time, they also realize that they are, responsible for taking charge of what happens to the environment. So it kind of makes them own their environment, it makes them own their community. It makes them, when a responsibility is placed on you, you're able to take more actions to that effect. And when you know that if you do not take actions, it has like a corresponding effect on you. So you tend to, be more proactive, more intentional, more careful, more conscious in whatever actions you're taking. So those are like the major way we do all of this. And then, of course, we have like community engagements with the community heads and youth and heads and even children within the community. So it's sort of like I mentioned, sort of, make everyone take ownership of it. So it doesn't seem like we're just coming to speak to the community head and the other ones are left alone. I don't know if you understand. So it's all like an integrated way of communicating with people and making them take ownership of it. So like those are the ways we tend to drive the message. Like I said, you localize languages. You don't make it seem like, okay, so for instance, climate change, we'll bring it down to, very simplistic languages that they can understand. And they don't think like it's just one of those things you come up with. And, that's how we do all of this.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing, Chikodi. I definitely think that, this like bringing it down to language that's relevant to people, like climate change is so vague and abstract. And I think those of us that work in the space can even talk about it much that we ourselves become numb to what it means, right? Whereas like really approaching communities who are already living it, right? Like they already have their own sets of problems. When you spoke about like water and actually like ensuring that there's education around like safe water habits and safe water usage, and then actually giving people the agency and the control over like, this is your community, this is your space, and empowering people with the right tools to be able to then safeguard their environment and work on a local scale to be able to take action. There's an analogy that I've heard a number of times. So at Force of Nature, we work a lot in eco-anxiety, which means we're always thinking about like, how do we actually like shift that hopelessness, that doomism into action? And one of the things we know to be true is if you give people an impossible task, they will get demotivated, right? And if we give people an impossible task, which is like, oh, let's solve climate change, right? We're all going to be demotivated. But giving people actionable, immediate tasks that you can A, see results of, but that B, have like a long-term positive effect on a community, like in community action, that's where we then get inspired and activated and engaged with an issue to continue doing work on it. And I think that's really important for all of us in any of these spaces, is the way that we communicate and the way that we engage with people has to be in such a way that it allows them to take action that they can see the results of, right? Rather than making it an abstract concept. I have so many more questions, and also I'm aware of time, and I wanted to invite anyone who has been listening. Do you have questions for one or all of the speakers on the topics of engaging with climate action? I know the topic of the seminar was engaging with climate science, and we've kind of gone climate action and climate activism. So hopefully you're also getting a lot out of the conversation. But we do have kind of 15 minutes remaining, and I would like to invite anyone who has any questions to pop them in the chat of Zoom. And in the meantime, I will stall for time and ask another question, because I definitely have plenty. But if you do have a question, now is the time to ask, or forever hold your peace. Although you can find all of these incredible change makers online. So I kind of want to have a little bit of a brief chat around language, which is something that I think we all know the power of, but we all have kind of like different terms and terminology. And I wanted to just touch on that quickly as an interim question in case any get asked in the chat. But we talk about fighting climate change and we talk about the climate crisis, right? And I'd love to hear your impressions or thoughts on language and the way that we talk around climate action, climate change, the climate crisis. And I'd love to start with you, Rooney. I know you don't like me surprising you with questions, but like, what are your thoughts on the language we use? And, you know, coming from a scientific background, like, what does it mean for you in thinking about the way we speak around climate?
Great question. I just took some time to think about the answer in my head. But I think the kind of language that we use ultimately affects, the way that we communicate it. So as Chikodi said, I mean, if we communicate it in a sense that conveys people that, there's a doom just, awaiting us and coming our way, that might get people to, care more about it. But at the same time, I think it's also gonna overwhelm them, because climate action, climate science, it's just this huge thing that's not easy to understand, because it just has so many different dimensions to it. I mean, like the academic dimension is just one of it, and there's just so many other. You could say, there's a cultural context. There's also, say, local context to it. So I think it's really important to be mindful of the language that we're using while communicating the climate crisis and the challenges associated with it. And I think we should try to communicate it in a manner that inspires people to be at the center of action. So, community-led solutions is going to be our biggest tool and our biggest strength in this movement. I'm not going to say it's a fight, because after all, the climate crisis is something that humans, did ultimately start themselves. I think the ultimate vision of, everything would just be to bring diverse communities together so that they're able to lead solutions and practices that will help us sort of decrease the impact of everything that's going on, while being mindful that equity, justice, accessibility, inclusivity, and accountability is also integrated.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate you going into depth on that. And I definitely think it's a great thought to have all the time. How are we communicating? What words are we using? How does it apply to the context that we're communicating to? And with that, my stalling worked well, and we had a bunch of questions all come through at once. So I'm going to start with a question, and this is open to whoever feels they're equipped to answer it. Who is someone who you think has done a good job of engaging the public around climate science? And that could be an organization or an individual. I would love to hear examples, if anyone has any that come to mind. Is there anyone that comes to mind? Feel free to just, to our panelists, feel free to just unmute yourself if there's someone that comes to mind.
I'm just going to hop right in.
Yeah.
I think it's actually a group of people, the Earthrise Studio, the Harris Brothers, and Alice. So they released this amazing documentary called The Seat at the Table. It's in YouTube originals. You can go and check it out. It's amazing. So they're doing a great job at communicating the challenges that's being faced by people all over the world and all over the UK due to the impacts of climate change. So I think that is something that I'd recommend for you to check out.
That's a great answer. I was going to share that also. So we're on the same page. So you have two panelists recommending you check out Seat at the Table. I have put the link to it in the chat. Does anyone else have Chikodi or Harley, anyone that you think does a good job of communicating climate science?
I think there's a lot of examples of individuals. Like two that come to mind would be people like, David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg. So I think the bigger thing there is this this idea that's been touched on before, this idea of translating science into really easily understandable and messages that are able to be connected to. So I think the reason those two kind of probably stand out to a lot of people, when they think about, have shaped the discourse around climate and around climate science, is because they have used information to tell really kind of human stories, and have told them in a way that is able to be connected with. So yeah, I think those would be, two that stand out to me as people who've shaped the conversation. And I think the way we talk about the climate now is in a large part shaped because of people like that. I also think there's a lot more insidious work at play behind the scenes. And I think a lot of the way we talk about climate now has been shaped by, a lot of groups who have investment in the industries that are propping up climate change, who have, the climate crisis, who have, decided ways of communicating and ways of speech that kind of push what they're talking about. So an example is actually the word, the phrase climate change, which was developed by a think tank on the more right side of the political spectrum to delegitimize the issue that we're facing and make it seem a lot less serious than it is. So I think there's the very public figures, and then there's also the recognition that there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes on what the language is used in the political arena, what language is being used by groups, and kind of how that influences the way we then think about the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Harley. Yeah, and interesting, there are so many people that have made mainstream the discourse on climate that I think has allowed more niche or focused groups to then adapt language and understanding and science towards much more specific issues or specific groups. One that came to mind for me that I just popped in the chat is called Aim High, and they're actually an organization in the UK that's focused on bringing really thorough climate education into schools and made it accessible for young people, which I think is really, really important. And so then it's the next step from having all the information out there is how do we actually then communicate that information to the right group. So Chikodi, I'd love to hear from you any examples of really effective communication around climate.
Yes, I was just about to mention climate podcast. Yes, so what he gets to do is led by Shay. What he gets to do is to have a podcast session with various community-led groups who are working on climate-related issues. They get to come on the podcast, and they get to have like a podcast session and get to discuss various ways of implementing projects or the kind of work that they have done in their various community. And then we also have the likes of eco champions, eco bata, recycle points, a couple of them. And what they do is that they use things like the trendy fun videos on TikTok, Instagram stories, and all of that. So they put out all of the things through things that people are quick to relate with, podcasts, Instagram stories, videos, and all of that. I'm so sorry, my background noise is coming in again. Yes, so those are the additions I would like to. Thank you.
That's awesome. And if you can put some of those links to the podcast that you mentioned in the chat for us, Chikodi, that would be awesome, so folks can check it out afterwards. I know we have like 5 minutes, so this might be a bit of a rush question. I wanted to address one more question in here. So there's a question around this came from Simon, who asked, it's well recognized that a method of persuading people to take action is to tell them how people like them are taking action. Does anyone on the panel have anything to tell us from their perspective about the diversity of people already taking action or communicating about it? And this actually kind of ties into the answer that you gave earlier, Rooney, around like how we actually ensure that the language that we're using is relevant to the people we're communicating to, but also just overall like diversity and inclusion and representation within like climate education and climate science. I'd love to hear from you on your thoughts on like your perspective of how, I suppose the question here is the diversity of people already taking action or communicating about it. What is your perspective on that?
That's a great question. And I think I could just, I had a lot of answers when I heard the question. I'm just blabbering at this point. Sorry about that. But just to make sure that I understood the question correctly, what is it exactly? Which part of it do you want me to answer?
Yeah, your just overall perspective on the diversity of people represented within climate education, and how you see that affecting the communities, or affecting the communities that you're communicating to. If you just want to speak a little bit on that. It's kind of like a vague question, but you can definitely touch on some of the points that you've spoken about before, or just overall like kind of the ways that we show people like them taking action.
Okay, so as for the diversity, I think we can definitely work on it, because unfortunately there's this term that I'm going to use, green colonialism. So it just refers to the north bias and the just the north bias and the white dominant narration of climate science and climate action, which repudiates the traditions and the knowledge of the global south. So we can definitely do better in terms of diversity by giving the platform to people who are actually impacted and people who are actually living through the consequences. And as you said, not just giving them the platform, but actively listening to them. So I think it's really important to let the impacted lead, because they will be able to make they will just be able to guide us towards the right direction and just come up with better restoration or even mitigation strategies. So I think it's really important to let the impacted lead. And do better in terms of diversity.
Yeah, I love that. There was definitely like a lot of talk in some of the People's Summit, which was a summit outside of COP that was led by the COP Coalition, which is like an organizing group and very much like human-centric and human-focused outside of the bureaucracy of the big institutions. There was a lot of conversation, a lot of like Indigenous leaders who were taking the stage and speaking on panels, and the conversation was around like not just like it is the Indigenous people that safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So why are those people not the ones in the decision-making rooms making decisions about like protecting and conserving and taking care of the land, right? It should not be a case that they have to show up and ask for space to world leaders who are do not have that wisdom, do not have the knowledge, do not have the tools to like safeguard the land and the communities who are now being most impacted, right? Which I think is such a brilliant point. I am aware of time, but I do want to allow for closing statements from each of our speakers because we've covered so much ground, and apologies if we did not get to your question. We have seen the questions that are in here. I know there's a question on Insulate Britain and like the way that they're communicating. I don't want to come to that because only because we only really have one speaker on the panel who's based in the UK. So I think that might be a little bit not as relevant for the entire panel, but I definitely think there's some points that we made around styles of communication that might be helpful to that question. And then examples of telling a good story. I definitely recommend you check out Seat at the Table. And I will drop a couple more links in there as well, including Vanessa's speech, but we will make sure that the Imperial crew has some of the different links that we can send through that you can then all take a look at. But I'd love to just come around to each of the speakers, closing statements, closing thoughts on the conversation we've had around engagement with climate science. Any last parting thoughts you would like to leave everyone with? And I'm going to go the opposite way to the way I've been traditionally going, and I'm going to call on you first, Chikodi. What are your closing thoughts or closing statements for everyone who's been listening? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes,
Okay.
to everyone listening, I just want to say that each one of us should be environmentalists taking action because our environment protects us and we need to take care of our environment. That will be all.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chikodi, for all of your sharing. And I know how stressful it can be being in a noisy space while you're on a webinar. So thank you for powering through with us. You've been fantastic.
Thank you.
And Harley, I'd love to come over for you. Closing statements, final thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I think being in the space of like climate action, but just being a human in the world right now, it can feel like absolutely terrifying, and particularly when things like COP happen and we feel like, you know, the choices and the decisions that need to be made aren't happening. And I think like what I always think and what I always feel like we should be talking about is the fact that we are all still here and we all do still have the capacity to make change. And I think like I hope, and I guess like if I can say one thing to finish, is that, you know, I believe that when we do come together, we can make change. And like by taking action and by believing that there is a better world that we can move towards, we can really kind of like take steps in the right direction. But it does take action, it does take work, and it does take people coming together with these shared visions and these differing like ways of communicating and really kind of pushing and building the world that we want. So yeah, I'd encourage everyone to do what they feel is the way that they feel they can make change, whether that's with Anamora Rebellion or with any of the other groups here. I think it's the time where we all need to start like stepping up and doing what we feel needs to happen.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Harley, and thanks for all your incredible contributions today as well. And I want to come over now to Rooney. Final thoughts and closing thoughts for folks who have been listening.
Yeah, so I was kind of, preparing myself to answer the question first, but that was a, I guess, good change, because I agree with everything Chikodi and Harley said for their closing statement. So something that I have to say is that, I really like the term that Harley used about being optimistic pessimist, if I'm not wrong. So something that I'd like to share is that if we continue to work thoughtfully on centering, resilience, justice, and mitigation in any of the climate solutions that we work on, that's gonna help us a long way. And despite the movement, it must go on. And despite whatever's happened the past couple of days and the past couple of weeks, I think there's still a reason to be hopeful because change is coming. It's inevitable, and it's coming from young people who truly care about the environment and the climate. So I think that's something to be hopeful about.
Yeah, that's really fantastic and such a good point. And I definitely am reignited after having spoken to all three of you. And I think for sure, like if we weren't all a little bit hopeful, we would not be in the movement, right? Because hope is about knowing what we're working towards and taking action towards it. One of my favorite quotes is that hope is a verb. And I think that everyone here is really taking action on that. And the final thing that I will leave everyone with, and I was popping all of the links to everyone's org in the chat, but I cannot multitask, as I warned everyone before the webinar, so I'm just going to keep chatting until we close, but you will get all the links via email afterwards. My final closing thought is a reminder, which is that the way that we communicate in this field, obviously you've heard from people of all different backgrounds here, climate science, but also climate activism and organizing. And I think one of the most important things is when we're communicating is always having a very, very clear objective around what we're communicating and how we're encouraging people to take action, meeting people where they are, ensuring that people feel empowered by bringing them like back to focus on an issue within their local community or within their sphere of influence, and ensuring that there's a really clear call to action of how we want people to then use the information that we're teaching them. And I think that that is a tactic that could be very widely applied across the sciences now, and often it's tempting to be apolitical, but now is not the time in history to be apolitical. So I really encourage everyone to think really carefully about the ways that they're communicating and what actions they might be looking to inspire off the back of that communication, and ensuring that we're giving the microphone to the people who are in the most affected communities to ensure that they're able to really determine their futures as well. So that is in closing. Thank you so much. This has been so much fun. I hope that everyone listening has enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. And do hang on, I have a quick closing statement that is on my script here. Thank you so much to our speakers, obviously, for being here, Arunima, Chikodi, and Harley. The recording of this discussion will be appearing on the Grantham website, so you can always catch it there if you had to dip out or if you'd like to share it with someone. So sorry to people whose questions didn't get answered, but feel free to send them through to any one of us afterwards, and we will review some of the questions and update links via email. And thank you all so much for being here. This marks the end of our session. Hope that you enjoy your weekend wherever you are, and yeah, we will see you online. All right, bye everyone.